Welcome to the next episode of Great War Story. And this episode is called Gallipoli. Did he stay or did he go? Because this is a personal story of my grandfather, because there is a family mystery over whether or not he actually was personally at Gallipoli, and I'll address that. But it's not just going to be that. There's plenty of good stories about events at Gallipoli and how some of the reinforcements were coming out, some of the lack of organization and the problems they were facing. And, well, let's just get down to it, shall we? So, let me lay out firstly the mystery and why it exists. Because we have this family history that was written by my uncle, the elder son of Robert Bruce Fowler, who was the World War One veteran. And I've already used his picture in a previous episode when I was talking about all those telegrams flying back and forth between London, New Zealand, and Australia. But that was actually a photo of my Uncle Duncan, who was a World War II veteran of the RAF, and there he is on a telegraph station. That's when he was a little boy, standing next to his father, Robert Bruce Fowler, the World War One veteran, and there he is as an old man. And if anybody should know the stories of what my grandfather went through in World War One, it ought to be Uncle Duncan, because my grandfather set up a business in Wellington long after he came back from World War One, and he ran a radio shop, R.B. Fowler, at 78 Manners Street in Wellington. And look at that phone number, 42242, a 5-digit telephone number. And after a while it became Fowler and Sons. And so surely, if my grandfather had a chance to talk to anybody about his World War One experiences, it would have been his eldest son. So let's look at the brief account he gives of what Grandad was up to around the time of Gallipoli. So from his recruitment, the first camp to which he was sent was at Waverley Racecourse, and from there they were moved south to several other locations prior to embarkation for overseas service. Conditions on the troopships were unpleasant to say the least. For those involved with the horses, things became almost unbearable once they reached the tropics, and it is not surprising that even the arid conditions found when they arrived in Egypt were a welcome relief. Bruce remained in Egypt until the Australian and New Zealand troops embarked on their ill-fated campaign against the Turks at Gallipoli. In common with many others, he went down with a serious attack of jaundice while still on the troopship, and was returned to a military hospital in Cairo. This was late in 1915, and once he recovered, he was transferred for training as a machine gunner in a regiment which was soon to be sent to the front line in France. Now, while I liked my Uncle Duncan a lot, I'm sad to say that what he wrote is riddled with mistakes. Let's just go through some of them. So, I know from my research that it wasn't the Waverley racecourse my grandfather was sent to, it was the Awapuni racecourse in Palmerston North. Somehow or other, Uncle Duncan completely missed the fact that my grandfather caught measles on the troopship and was in quarantine for 30 days through the worst of the tropics. So for 30 days, in fact, my grandfather had a lazy time in the quarantine section of the ship and had to do no hard labor at all. He was one of the lucky ones. And then this is not so much a mistake, but it implies something false. It makes it look like he was there at the opening of the campaign, April 25th, 1915, but in fact, his unit did not embark until several weeks later. Now, a serious attack of jaundice while on the troopship? Well, that's wrong too, as I will show you from his military file a little later. He did get jaundice, but it was not on the troopship. And actually, I just spotted another mistake. The military hospital wasn't in Cairo, it was in Alexandria. And then once he recovered, he was transferred to training as a machine gunner. No, he was sent to France, and while in France, he suffered a serious wound to his shoulder. I will make an episode in future about the circumstances of how he got wounded in the shoulder in 1916. And after that, he was sent to England to recuperate. And it was in 1917 that he eventually joined the machine gunners. So this is something I've commented on before, and I will say it again, I'm sure. I don't trust family histories because there are traditions, there are stories, but they're usually half remembered, or they conflate two different things that happened at different times, that kind of thing. Now, why is there a mystery at all, though? Well, here we have my grandfather's demobilization certificate from 1919. And here it lists where he served and how long. So 60 days in New Zealand, 1 year and 220 days in England, 360 days in Egypt, 1 year and 80 days in France or Belgium. But the problem is it lists 135 days at Gallipoli. Now, if you look at the account of Uncle Duncan and all the stories we have in the family, there's something wrong there. And then elsewhere in the military file, it says something rather similar. It says, when it lists all of the places where he served in Egypt, he served in Western Europe, and it says right there, he served at Gallipoli. Now, this is odd, because I've said before that ANZAC Day is a big deal. To have an ancestor at Gallipoli is something to boast about, something to talk about. It would be the equivalent for an American to say that they had an ancestor at Gettysburg, they had an ancestor at D-Day, or for somebody British or Dutch or even French for that matter, to say that one of their ancestors fought in the Battle of Waterloo. It would be strange for it to go the other way round. The official military record saying the ancestor was at this pivotal battle, but for the family tradition to say, nope, he wasn't there, it didn't happen. If it's going to be an exaggeration, you expect it to be the other way round. So this is a problem. My family tradition says he wasn't there. The military record seems to say that he did have quite a lot of time at Gallipoli. So what is going on? Well, before I get onto that, I added some more slides to really hammer home what a big deal ANZAC Day is in New Zealand. There's a photo of a massive ANZAC Day commemoration in Wellington in 1932, but it hasn't stopped. This is from the 100th anniversary in New Zealand, and this wasn't the main one, this was a little sideline one, because they actually have a Turkish memorial. You can see the Turkish flag flying, and I've actually been there. One time I visited Wellington after my grandfather passed, and my step-grandmother Anwell took me there to have a look at it. And this was after I had visited Gallipoli, and the cliffs that go down to the sea really do quite strongly resemble that area where the battle was fought. And Anwell had actually gone to one of the ANZAC Day services at this location, and she had even talked to the Turkish ambassador and rather enjoyed that. And here is some footage at the Auckland War Memorial Museum of the dawn service in 2015. Look at all those people who got up so very, very early to be there for a dawn service. So as I said, ANZAC Day is a big deal. To have an ancestor who was at Gallipoli would be something to boast about. So let's see what the military file says. Well, it says he embarked for the Dardanelles on the 12th of May, 1915. So far, so good. It looks like he's going to Gallipoli. On the other hand, we have some other entries here that seem to say he's not at Gallipoli. So, September the 8th, he's admitted to the 17th General Hospital in Alexandria. Remember, I said it wasn't in Cairo. And he's suffering from bursitis and jaundice. And then, September the 19th, he's transferred to Glemenapolo, which is a convalescent hospital also in Alexandria, right on the coast, in fact. And I suspect the reason he was suffering from bursitis was, well, because of that. It was hard labour, and bursitis is a repetitive strain injury of the elbow. Now, there's one thing in the military file which is quite interesting. It says next to the fact that he was sent to Gallipoli and then he was discharged, a single word, disappeared. Now, that does seem to match up with the family story, because the family story says that at one point when he was hospitalized, he thought it was a waste of time and he got absolutely sick and tired and bored of it and decided to go sightseeing on his own and then got busted by the MPs. So that single word disappeared seems to actually say there may be something to that family story. Now let's return to the Mounted Field Ambulance ward diary, because that gives us some more details about what is going on. By this stage, it's no longer neatly typed up, it's just Colonel Thomas's handwriting, but at least it's reasonably legible. And it says on May the 7th, 1915, received orders to take unit to Alexandria with Mounted Brigade. Now the photo does indeed show the Mounted Brigade horses on a train in Alexandria, but it's actually when they disembarked in December of 1914, and it shows the horses being sent away from Alexandria, but it was the best I could find for a photo. And then the war diary continues. For the week ending Saturday, 15th of May, 1915, Mounted Rifle Field Ambulance. May 9th, arrived at Alexandria at 5:30 a.m. Whole unit with transport and equipment complete, embarked on troopship Kingstonian B-15 and left port early next morning. And to my great delight, I was able to find a photo of the Kingstonian. Not just a photo of the Kingstonian, but a photo of the Kingstonian on this exact occasion when it was loading, getting ready to go up towards the Dardanelles. And if you see all those wagons lined up in front of it, that may very well be wagons of the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance. It's quite possible that one of those figures in the foreground is actually my grandfather. And the caption at the Australian War Memorial Museum is this: Transport B-15 Kingstonian, in which we went up to the Dardanelles the first time. Lying at Timber Yard Dock, Alexandria, May 15th. And it's related to a collection of an Australian doctor who was with the Australian Field Ambulance, who also went on the ship. Now that date, May 15, is probably wrong. We'll come back and visit that in just a moment. Now, I've quoted before some letters written by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas, the commander of the Field Ambulance, and he had quite a lot to say in a letter that he wrote to his wife. Oh, and what happened, I should give some background context here. The officers were all told to take any signs of their rank off, and all their shiny buttons and badges had to be dulled and all of the rest. So normally he'd be walking around and everybody would know he was a senior officer or a lieutenant colonel. But at this stage, he was wearing no symbols of rank, so everybody thought he could have been a private. So this is what he had to say about that. Not having any badge of rank on leads to some funny situations. One man in charge of 2 draft horses handed one over to me with, "Here, old man, you can take this one for me." So I had to lead this faithful animal onto the ship and along slippery alleyways and sharp turnings until I eventually got him in his right place. I was moving things in my cabin when the steward came along and asked me if I was Colonel Thomas's servant. He carried on. The troopship was built originally for cattle and horses on the American coast, consequently very suitable for horses, but not much accommodation for officers and men. Men supposed to sleep in hammocks slung at night over the tables in their quarters. Troopship been doing service for many months. Consequently, hammocks very lousy, so men advised to sleep on deck or on the floors, which they did. Men on biscuits and bully beef served out for the voyage. Tea available on board, and a few extras can be bought at the canteen. But men came away at short notice and could not be paid before leaving, consequently very little money on board. and he comments that the sea was like glass the whole way. Now, I don't know if this photo really shows sea like glass, but I went through my photo albums and I looked for a personal photo that resembled it as best I could do, so that's what I chose. But still, I'm quite proud of that photo. I think it came out quite well with the seagull. Now, I spent quite a long time getting photos of logbooks when I was at the UK National Archives, and I didn't just get the logbooks of the ANZAC convoy in 1914. I tried to get the logbooks for other ships that also fitted into my grandfather's story. And here is the logbook of the Kingstonian. Now, Colonel Thomas made a comment about the food the men were being fed, and a few days earlier, there's quite an interesting and, to me at least, amusing episode that is recorded in the logbook of the Kingstonian in relation to the quality of the food that was available on board. May 4th, 1915. This is to say that several of the sailors brought their salt beef and beans aft and complained that same was unfit to eat. It was examined by the master and tasted by him, and found to be good and wholesome, and nothing the matter with it. Thereupon J. Grimes, able seaman, threw the meat and beans overboard, at the same time saying, "No fucking dinner, no fucking work." I now log J. Grimes, able seaman, for wasting the owner's stores and fine him. But interestingly, in a little bit of text written right next to this entry, it says, "Fine was not charged against J. Grimes." So perhaps there really was something wrong with the food. And aside from that, I thought it was quite funny that the master chose to record the exact language that the sailor said as he threw the food overboard. Anyway, we have back to the logbook. We have where they were and what time they were leaving and where they were going and all the rest. So May the 15th, it says that was when they embarked, which does contradict, as I said, what that Australian doctor said, but I'm pretty sure his dates are wrong. It wasn't May the 15th. You can see here they left Alexandria on May the 10th. And by May the 15th, they were actually at Lemnos, and you can see a photo here of the massive collection of ships. Lemnos was the major staging area and also protected against U-boats. So when they weren't at Gallipoli, this is where they all were. And we have a diary from another man who was also aboard the same ship. He was an Australian with the 2nd Australian Light Horse Regiment, Alan Nash. Sadly, he landed at Gallipoli, but he didn't get to leave. He was killed in June of that year. This is what he wrote. May 10. Kingstonian left Alexandria at 10:30 a.m. Lovely cool breeze all day. Everyone on board very sociable. 38 officers on board, but only accommodation for 20. Wednesday, 12th of May. A wonderful fine day. Sea smooth as glass. Arrived off Dardanelles about 6:30, dusk. Heavy bombardment started. Watch flash of ships' guns and flash of shells until 11 p.m. Tremendous rattle of machine guns and rifle fire. British attacking Turks' position. No particulars available. Thursday, 13th May. Woke up to the sound of guns. Our ship is anchored off Cape Helles. Many warships in view, also transports and 2 hospital ships. Watching position of Turks through telescope. Moved on to Kapa Tepe. Landed with 19 men. Left 22 men to look after the horses on board the Kingstonian. So what are we talking about here? Here's a map of where the battle was happening. And let's carry on with Colonel Thomas. Arrived at mouth of Dardanelles just after dark on May 12th. Bombardment going on. Well, that certainly matches Nash's account. Could see the shells bursting and the flash of guns, which could be heard very clearly as they were only about 2 miles away. When anchored, were surrounded by numbers of warships of all sizes and shapes, many of them French. When at anchor, there was very much increased cannonading and a very hot rifle fire going on land. HMS Goliath was sunk in the Dardanelles during the night. And you can see I put a little picture of a ship up there next to Cape Helles. That is roughly where the Goliath was. And she wasn't sunk by a torpedo from a submarine. It was actually a Turkish destroyer that penetrated the British naval screen and managed to get close enough to put 3 torpedoes into the side of the Goliath. And, well, many men died. So, back to the war diary of the field ambulance. Anchored off Point Alice, night of Thursday 13th. Well, there's no such place as Point Alice. I wasted an awful lot of time looking for it, until I eventually realized, of course, it was a spelling mistake based on the pronunciation. It wasn't Point Alice, it was Cape Helles. And then, May 14th, anchored off Gallipoli midday, ordered to transship to Gallipoli next morning. Now, Nash had misspelled it. Again, I suspect, based on the pronunciation, it wasn't a K, it was a G. Gallipoli. And Gallipoli was later to be called ANZAC Cove. This is what it looked like at the time. These are the New Zealand troops massed down there on that very narrow beach against those sheer slopes with the Turks commanding the heights above. And Lieutenant Colonel Thomas continues, and this must have been the view that they were looking at, indeed the view my grandfather would have been looking at. Received orders at about 10 a.m. to go further up the coast where Australians and New Zealanders landed. Have just arrived and lowered anchor. Place where they landed almost like the side of a steep cliff covered with scrub going straight down to the beach, which is hardly perceptible. We steamed up parallel with the coast about 2 miles from it and saw the Turks' shrapnel bursting close to some of our troops that were evidently retiring. Then, as we went to lunch, they were at it hammer and tongs with rifle fire. We could not see the trenches our men were firing from. There was an airship flying at the Dardanelles, at which the Turks had several shots. Their shells seemed to burst fairly close to the flying ship, but did no harm. I'm almost certain he's referring to a plane at this point, not some kind of blimp. Our men on shore opposite us have gained no ground for 18 days and are just holding on until the force below joins them. We can see shells bursting every now and then amongst their trenches. They are getting from 20 to 40 casualties a day. We do not go ashore tonight. We have to put out all lights, as the naval authorities have warned us that they are expecting a submarine in the night to be amongst the ships. This letter I may get through privately, but I doubt being able to write more than postcards in future. And that is what it looks like today. There's somewhat of a beach in the foreground, and that's where they take you, and there's an ANZAC memorial over there in the distance on that small green strip of grass. And when I went there as a young man with a tour group, they let us swim in the water there. And it was a very pleasant swim, but I would warn you, there are a bunch of sea urchins just under the surface, so you do have to be careful where you place your feet, otherwise you'll get some nasty spikes in them. Now, Colonel Thomas continues. Horses and wagons and transport personnel to return to Alexandria. Beg your pardon, this is still written by Colonel Thomas, but this is in the war diary. Horses and wagons and transport personnel to return to Alexandria. May 15th, order to transship to Gallipoli cancelled. Sailed for Lemnos Island. Transshipped to Gallipoli later in the day. Can you imagine what it must have been like trying to move horses back and forth between ships and things like this? Must have been a nightmare. And this is now a letter written a few days later to his wife. Aboard the troopship Kingstonian B-15. We landed some engineers and signallers, but my field ambulance and an Australian field ambulance remained on board as they had plenty on shore. We had orders to go on a hospital ship next morning with our medical equipment, but to leave behind on board our 78 horses and wagons and ASC in charge. They would have to go straight back to Alexandria as they could not possibly be used on land. So this gave me confirmation of something that I had suspected based on the field ambulance diaries. This is the explanation for why my grandfather never landed at Gallipoli. He came very, very close. They spent 2 days offshore. They witnessed fighting. They witnessed casualties. They witnessed artillery. There was even a British warship torpedoed and sunk very close to them. But it was because he was a driver, a private in charge of horses, attached from the Army Service Corps, the ASC, to the Mounted Field Ambulance. So you can see how the Army bureaucrats would have got confused. They would look up, what unit was he in? He was in the Field Ambulance. Where was the Field Ambulance? The Field Ambulance was doing service at Gallipoli. Therefore, my grandfather was at Gallipoli. What they hadn't realized was that the ASC men who were looking after the horses had been sent back to Egypt. Thomas continues, this of course applied also to the Australian Field Ambulance and also about 600 other horses, crossed out, that should never have been sent. Then he carries on. Why were we allowed to bring horses and wagons, I do not know. Of course, as a field ambulance, we are useless without them as a unit. But of course, they were all medically trained and they could carry on and do good medical service. Later, they would in fact be landed at Gallipoli, and in a massive but failed offensive in August, Colonel Thomas himself would be killed by a Turkish artillery shell. So the mystery, I think, has been solved because my grandfather came very, very close to Gallipoli but never landed. He did at least see it, and I can't help feeling that I am only here because of that fortunate chance that he was not disembarked at Gallipoli and did not have to go through that campaign, because a lot of New Zealanders died there, and who knows what the fortune of war would have brought. But he was spared that and instead sent back to Egypt, and in Egypt, this is what he was doing. He was caring for the horses, and there were hundreds of them. Well, there were the 78 in his unit, but all those mounted infantry units that had come from New Zealand with all of their horses aboard the transports, they were left in Egypt, while the mounted units were sent as infantry, as reinforcements, well, to die, many of them, at Gallipoli, and all of those horses would have had to have been cared for. No wonder he came down with a repetitive strain injury in September of 1915.